Well, Fabian, welcome.
Nice to meet you. Thank you very much.
Good of you to come today. I'm talking today to Fabian Gregory, coach of the South African men's hockey team, here at the 2014 edition of the Azlan Shah Cup in Malaysia. So good to have you here, Fabian. Let me just ask you a couple of questions about your philosophy on the game. What would you say are the critical factors in creating a winning hockey team?
Yeah, it's a bit difficult seeing that you come from Africa, and the only winning we do at international level at the moment is from a consistency level is winning the African Cup. So it's quite a challenge when you go to some of the more prestigious events like the Olympic Games and the World Cup and Commonwealth Games, where you're a little further down in the pecking order. But I think it's more important that we try to develop a culture of sustainability. And if you can probably try and get that sustainability going, then you can try to achieve better results at the end of it. I think an important thing for us at the moment is trying to keep our players in the system for longer periods on end. So one of the routes is that a number of our players are now playing in Europe, and then we also have a number of players that are playing back at home, and our competition at home is obviously not competitive enough to sustain their ability and also to sustain their income, which also becomes an issue for us trying to keep them in the system. So you often find there's a big turnover of players, and obviously the level of the players leaving the system and the newer ones coming in, the gap becomes quite big. So that's one of probably the biggest challenge for me as a coach, keeping them in the system.
Okay, we see hockey's got a particular aspect, which is the short corner, and now we have the drag flicker, which is the current way of executing the short corner. How important is it in the modern game to have a specialist drag flicker?
Yeah, I think it's probably if you look at the amount of goals being scored, there's a high percentage of goals being scored from penalty corner than instead of field goal. So you find teams going into matches and into tournaments having probably 3 specialist flickers, and it's easy to change at will if the one is off form and the other one just steps up on the plate. The interesting thing is how many of them are really top international hockey players. So you often find, and it's one thing that I've always questioned, is that how good are those? Are they really the best international hockey players? In some instances not, but they are the best at what they do. And in my opinion, I think the penalty corners maybe taken a lot out of the game, where everybody seems to be playing for the corner instead of obviously taking the easier goal shot, because I think the percentages are probably a little bit better from the corner. So yeah, the specialist, it's become, and they've also become quite marketable. So every country is looking at how they can improve the penalty corner. And if you look at the top teams, a lot of games and a lot of tournaments are being decided by the penalty corner.
I'm not sure just how this next issue impacts on you from your previous statement, but I'll ask you the question. You've got your team selection, and of course there's always a number of people who select themselves. Others, you come right down to the very end selection criteria, you're left with 2 people. Out of those 2 people, how do you end up and select just that final one?
The final one is quite interesting, because I often find myself with the dilemma, you might find that you get 2 players that are very alike, and one might be slightly better, but for me it's always about what attitude and what dynamics that does the last person bring, because it might be the last one is not always going to be the one that gets a hell of a lot of game time, but how does that person also interpret him or his place in the group? And that's important, that person is always going to be the one that's bubbling, that brings the energy to the group, because if that person is always going to be the one that's lagging behind, you tend to draw energy. And I think it's important that you have a big and a happy group where everybody makes a contribution on and off the field. And I think if you're going to have something that draws energy, it makes it very difficult to sustain the level of competitiveness and make sure the dynamics in the group remain constant, sustainable, and for the length of the tournament.
Okay, well, you've made your selection, you've got down to your final squad. How do you motivate your players?
I think playing international hockey in itself should be a big motivating factor for players, and especially in the situation we find ourselves in. We don't play a huge amount of international hockey, such as the European countries where the travelling distance is quite short. We have large distances to travel. So any international match is exceptionally important, and there's a lot of pride at stake as well. And players want to stay in the system for as long as possible. If you look at, we have the most capped South African players, one of the ex-coaches was just off 250 caps. And if you compare that, and that's over probably close to 15 years. And if you look at some of the other players who've just finished their careers, Dwyer ended up on about 450, I think, or something to that effect. Dwyer's just over 300 now. So it's interesting to see how that transpires. But I think for the players that we have in the country, playing international hockey is exceptionally important. There's a lot of pride at stake. Just being a South African in itself, playing international sport is a massive, massive achievement. I think I'm driving into my group that yes, it's all good and well to play international hockey, but how good are you actually to compete with the best in the world? We'd like to increase that level. For sure I'm driving my players to make the level in the group a lot more competitive, so that we're able to compete at a high level and maybe push ourselves to see how far we can actually get in as close as possible to the top 6, top 4 in the world.
Okay, well, you've got your team, you've motivated them, or they motivated themselves, whichever. Something's not quite going right. How do you then criticise your players?
I think twofold. I think it's important that the criticism is always brought out in a positive way, not a negative way, because I've experienced being an ex-player myself that you become a little bit withdrawn, and especially if you're being showed out in public. I don't think there's a place, but I think in the group that I'm in, and the culture that we're finding, that we're open to criticism in the group that we find ourselves in, that I've also opened it up to the players to be open and criticize each other on the level of performance, because we as individuals and we as a group expect top level performance all the time, and they need to take ownership on what their responsibility is, and that's the performance on the field. And I open that up to them to criticize, because they have a role in not only the playing part, but I've opened up the communication lines around the tactics that we use. So the ownership is collective. It doesn't only become a Fabian Gregory show, but it's a collective ownership where everybody has a role to play and everybody makes a contribution. So when we criticize, that we criticize each other openly, and once the meeting is done, the criticism stops and the comments stop and it's over, and we move on and we work hard and make sure that our performance is much better for the following day.
Okay. Players these days, we find, former times we used to have fullbacks, midfield players, forwards. Now we find players, they run all through the lines, 4 or 5 substitutions at a time, and players have to be able to multitask. How do you develop the all-round player?
Interesting you asked the question. I had a discussion with the journalist a couple of weeks ago about exactly the same thing, about this more total hockey, if you can call it that, where you're trying to evolve the skill level and the skill set that the individual players have. But I think the game has evolved so much that because of the rule changes, and just also the speed at which the game is played, so one of the major attributes is the speed that players, not only in decision making, but also the speed at which they run, speed at which they move with the ball, speed at which the ball moves. All of those factors play a massive role in developing the skill set of the player. So for me it's important that you not only develop the technical side of it, but I think if you can create all these scenarios in your tactical training, I think the players will make an improvement in the better decision making and the speed of thought as well.
When a player first receives the ball, what's the very first thing that they should do?
In my opinion, I think they should have a fair idea of what they're going to do before they receive the ball. I think it's something that we are working exceptionally hard on the pre-scan. So you have a number of options that open up for you as an individual player. Inevitably, you have some set plays that you'd say would like to play the ball into these areas of the field.
Yes.
And sometimes, as international hockey is, coaches and players work out systems and they try to nullify the strength that you have. So you'd like to see the individual player bring some individual flair to it.
Yes.
And it's usually the ones that make the best decisions before they receive the ball, and the second phase after they've received the ball that end up being the best players in the world. And in our case it's exactly the same thing. So you have a preference of which players want to receive a ball in which areas of the field. But yeah, for me the pre-scan is exceptionally important, and I think that will pretty much dictate what your next phase is going to be.
Okay, that leading on from there then, the forward receives the ball. Do you have any rules about when that forward should take on the defence or when they should lay the ball back?
I think the key thing for me again comes down to the pre-scan. So you'll be able to find combination plays. So is there a person that you can probably play a vertical pass to? If not, can we play a supporting pass which is sideways, which is non-threatening, meaning that there's no turnover?
Yes.
Or do we then play the possession pass? Because we're playing the possession pass, it means that defensively the opposition have set up quite well. So for me, I give the players the license to say if the combination pass is available, play the combination, which is going to get us vertical progression without having the threat of the turnover. And I think the second thing is I always give the players the license. We have exceptionally skilled players. I always give them the opportunity to express themselves and say in high areas of the field, go ahead and express yourself. I think we are trying to get more people to the game of hockey, and I think that's one of the exciting aspects that I think we tend to suffocate the players if we pass the ball back quite a lot. I can't score goals if I'm passing back, so I want to go forward.
Okay. Final question, Fabian. Over the previous years, in fact, if you look back in time and watch a game of hockey or a recorded game, you can tell when the game was played, just because of the rules that the game is played under. We see a lot of rule changes. If you could change one rule in hockey, what would you change and why?
Maybe the penalty corner.
Yes.
Yeah, I think the penalty corner would probably. I quite enjoy. I got to be honest. I quite enjoy the shootout, the 1v1.
Yes.
I really enjoy the 1v1 in the 8-second rule. I think it's brought a different dynamic. It's brought an exceptional skill level to it as well. So that's probably the one thing I think. The penalty corner. I think it would also make the game a little more competitive, and obviously also bring the countries outside of the top 6 a little bit closer, because if you look at the top 6, you'll find that countries in the top 6 have an exceptional penalty corner.
Yes.
And if you look lower down the tier, you'll find 1 or 2 countries have exceptional penalty corner specialists, but generally the all-round play around the general play is not up to the standard where you can say that's a team that you can really push to become an international team. Interestingly enough, if you look at obviously budgets become a big issue, but and the interesting, you look at Formula 1 now, they're introducing budget caps, and they're also doing it in football and rugby.
Yes.
And it's been interesting to see how the competitiveness of those respective leagues, what's going to happen with the competitiveness of the leagues, because obviously with budget caps you're not going to be able to spend millions on the best players in the world. But, it's going to be interesting. But for me, I think if you change the penalty corner, I think it would be a decent one. I quite enjoyed the own goal rule. Yeah. I got to admit, I really enjoyed the own goal rule. I think I can understand that if I was having a rethink on the danger aspect.
Yes.
But I just think it was an exciting aspect that you could play balls into the D, a lot more circling, there's a lot more opportunities to score, not only from the attacking stick but from the defensive stick as well.
Yes.
And it brought a lot of tactical awareness and technical awareness, so you couldn't just deflect the ball out anymore. There's now an awareness where you have to receive the ball solidly, because if it bounces anywhere else, it's an opportunity for the rebound or the own goal.
Yes. So it's certainly exciting times in the game.
Yeah, for sure.
Fabian, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.